Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Stone Chapel Podcast. I'm David Capes. Just a few minutes, Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing is going to join me for a conversation to talk about C.S. Lewis and the problem of pain. The Stone Chapel Podcast is part of the Church Leaders Podcast Network. We are dedicated to resourcing church leaders to help them face all the complexities of ministry. The Church Leaders Podcast Network supports pastors and ministry leaders by doing a variety of things, including providing insights and theological content and offering some practical steps that are going to help church leaders navigate what's going on today in culture. You can learn more about that at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast network. Ed Stetzer, let's hear from you.
You know, if you listen to the podcast, you know that I love research. I used to lead a research company. So I love when research helps to illustrate a question we have. And one of the questions a lot of people are having is, how do we look to the decline of the family, maybe the relationship around fatherhood and issues of faith and church? Well, again, the Communio nationwide study on faith and relationships actually points to the collapse of marriage, where resident fatherhood fits into that, and how they all point ultimately to a relationship to Christianity and decline in the church. So visit communio.org/study to download Communio's nationwide study on faith and relationships.
Hey, thanks, Ed. So grateful for your help and your leadership. On September the 21st, 2024, Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing will give a lecture at the Houston campus of the Lanier Theological Library on C.S. Lewis and the problem of pain. She's a public theologian who lives not far from Oxford with her husband and 3 kids. That's where she did her doctorate, by the way. On this podcast, we discuss Lewis and aspects of his approach to the problem of pain and suffering. He was well familiar with pain and suffering through childhood trauma, through living through and being wounded in the First World War, and particularly later on, the death of his wife, his beloved wife, to cancer. How do we address the question intellectually and personally? How do we help others do that? Well, can Lewis help us? That's what we're going to be talking about. So today, Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing on the Stone Chapel Podcast.
Hello, I'm Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing. I'm a theologian based at the University of Aberdeen, where I'm an honorary lecturer in divinity, and I'm also a distinguished scholar at Wheaton College.
Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing. Amy, good to see you. Welcome back to the Stone Chapel Podcast.
Thank you so much. What a joy to be with you.
It's great to see you. You've had a busy schedule. You may not know, but you were on before this podcast. You were here at the Lanier Theological Library. We recorded a session together where we had after a lecture, and
Yes.
it was dealing with your book, Mary's Voice, and you did a wonderful job. And we took that audio and we sort of crafted it and turned it into a podcast. So this is your second
wonderful.
time, even if you don't know
I
it.
certainly remember that evening very fondly. Yes,
It was a great time.
beautiful.
I mean, there in the East
Yeah.
Reading Room of the library. We love doing that after the evening meal. For those who don't know Amy Orr-Ewing, who is she?
Well, you can probably tell from my accent, first of all, that I'm British. And
That gave it away.
I live just south of Oxford, and I did my undergraduate and my doctoral work at the University of Oxford. My research interest was in Dorothy L. Sayers, and in particular in her apologetic approach and impact. And for the last 25 years, I've been involved in public advocacy for the Christian faith, a bit like apologetics, but basically talking about the Christian faith in a way that people who don't believe it find compelling, persuasive, have the opportunity to ask questions. And I've spoken in more than 40 countries. I've written a few books, and I'm married. My husband is ordained in the Church of England, but he's not leading a local church anymore. He's involved as a theologian and leadership programs as well. And we have 3 sons, teenagers, twins,
wonderful.
and another one. And yeah, we live just south of Oxford.
Now, you're going to be here at the Lanier Theological Library doing a lecture in the fall of 2024. The date of that lecture is September the 21st. And the focus of that lecture is going to be C.S. Lewis and the problem of pain. Our goal in this podcast is not for you to do the lecture for us, but just to kind of whet the appetite, foreshadow a little bit of what you're going to be talking about, because we'll probably you'll have hundreds of people here for that lecture. But we also hope to have hundreds, if not thousands, of people listening in to that lecture, and maybe if they can't do it at the exact time, then finding it on YouTube and being able to listen and benefit from it. Problem of pain, it is the universal problem, right? Tell us a little bit about your lecture and about C.S. Lewis's approach to that problem.
Sure.
There's a book entitled The Problem of Pain.
There is indeed, yes. And one of Lewis's most well-loved books is called The Problem of Pain. Absolutely. I think whoever we are, whether we live in the affluent West, whether we've been Christians for a long time, or whether we're, working in more deprived areas, or, not being a Christian for a very long time, whoever we are, inevitably we are going to face the problem of suffering, the question of how God could be loving and this be the world that is. And we're going to face it on a number of levels, probably intellectually. How do we reconcile those two big ideas? If God existed and was all powerful and he actually loved this world, so if he's powerful enough to do something about it and he's loving enough to do something about it, why wouldn't he? Why would there be the kind of suffering that there is in this world? So there's an intellectual question there. There's also a personal dimension to this question, because as we get older, inevitably in life, we're all going to face difficulty, struggle, suffering, perhaps even trauma. And so it's really, really important topic. Now, what Christians of the last few decades have found is that there are a few sources that stand the test of time, and one of those is C.S. Lewis. And that is interesting on lots of levels, because this is a man who was kind of mainly, living in the 1940s. You kind of think, how could it still be relevant today? But his writing has really stood the test of time. And so in the lecture, we're going to be looking at his approach. Now, one of the things that's interesting about his approach is, you've mentioned the problem of pain, which is very famous. He also wrote a book called A Grief Observed, and that relates to his own very visceral experience of suffering upon the death of his beloved wife, Joy. And so we're going to be drawing a bit on that as well, and looking at how Lewis very effectively engages with this question of suffering at an intellectual level, at a personal level. And then also I'm hoping to have some time as well to consider how he does this on a creative level through narrative. Because one of the things he does so brilliantly is yes, to write readable philosophical theology, but he also writes amazing stories. Yes. And he also writes, the screw tape letters, which are just absolutely genius, aren't they? His imagined conversations between a junior devil and a senior devil in hell. So, I'm really looking forward to the lecture, delving into the kind of the theory side, the intellectual side, how that can actually serve us still today, as well as these two other dimensions, the personal and the narrative. And I maybe hope as well to make a few suggestions as to ideas that roll on from Lewis that apply to our current cultural moment. I work in apologetics today, not 20, 30, 40 years ago. So how to some of what he was beginning to see and argue, how might that actually be worked out today in our public discussions of the Christian faith?
Well, a lot of people, many people that I know, have sort of given up on the faith because of the problem of suffering. I mean, they see it, in some way. Maybe it is an intellectual thing, or maybe they themselves have experienced a huge trauma, a huge loss, and this grief is just, in a sense, stymied them from having any kind of faith. So this is for Christians as well as for people who aren't believers because of this, right?
Absolutely. So this is for Christians who need to be prepared to face this question themselves.
Mm.
I think it's for Christians who find themselves on the way to the back door of the church, who, have believed, have known God, but are really, really questioning and struggling. Maybe for anyone pastoring people in that kind of situation as well.
Mm.
But I also think that the lecture will be, and Lewis's work certainly is relevant for people who are engaging with unbelievers for whom this is the main reason they don't believe.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're a church pastor and you have evangelistic outreaches or programs, hopefully this will also be a kind of equipping experience for you and those you lead to think deeply about this subject, the problem of pain.
It's been a while now since I've read the book, and I'm going to read it again before you come. But my recollection is he deals also with the pain of animals in the animal world as well, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. Let's not do too many spoilers, but
okay.
C.S.
Lewis
was quite concerned about whether animals would be in heaven.
Yeah.
And actually, it's quite interesting, isn't it, when you think about the narrative, the Narnia stories, the centrality and the warmth of animals, of all God's creatures. There's just such love for creation there, which is kind of pretty beautiful.
Yeah, it really is. And, I do know some people that, work in animal rescue, and they work with a variety of different animal, rescuing horses or rescuing older animals that could be, abused or that kind of thing. And so there are people that really do have those kind of questions. How here we are supposed to be tending this world and caring for it in the most godly way. We're supposed to be like God in tending the world. And yet we sort of look the other way and aren't really concerned when animals, let's say, or other people suffer in another place. Mm. It's very personal to us, I guess.
Yeah, and obviously that's a kind of interesting strand for some people. But I mean, Lewis also, in The Problem of Pain, delves into questions like, if God were loving, why wouldn't he intervene and stop the atrocity from happening
in the first place
before it happened? Yeah. Why wouldn't a loving God do that? Those questions that so many people, including children, I think all my children have asked me that question at some point. Mm-hmm. So anyone who's a parent who wants to help their children grow up in the Christian faith, this is really helpful and really deeply practical, although on one level it sounds a bit philosophical.
Mm-hmm. Some people say, well, you can only ponder the question of suffering. You can't really solve it. I know I've heard that kind of statement before from people in philosophy and theology, that in fact the answering of the question why is far more difficult, maybe above our pay grade at this point. Mm-hmm. But it is right, it is good for us to ponder that and to think about it.
Yes, I think I would maybe put it this way, because sometimes to say something like that can just sound a bit like, well, therefore we shouldn't try and really think about it, or maybe it would be lacking in faith to try and kind of reason in some way around this question. But actually the Bible does ask the question. I mean, you
over and again,
the psalmist kind of cries out, why do the wicked prosper? There are so many iterations of the question of suffering in Scripture. And one of the things I think Lewis does really well, and that's really interesting in this regard, is that he's not claiming that there's a sort of slam dunk philosophical proof or mathematical proof in some way that will just forever answer every person with regard to this question. But he's saying we can't necessarily answer every angle and every degree of it, but there is something we can say. There is quite a lot we can say. And, as Christians, there's quite a lot that the Christian faith has to offer in a loving God and a broken world, that is true and that makes sense of our reality. And there is a contrast to the alternatives, whether they be materialism, the idea that there's no God, or the other views about suffering put forward by other faith positions. The Christian position on this, on the question of suffering, is unique, and it's really beautiful. So it may not be comprehensive in the sense that, of course, there's a massive mystery. We're still left with pain and question marks, but it's not that there's nothing to say. Right. And often I think in the church, in the sort of even within evangelicalism, the tendency has been to just maybe say, oh, it's a mystery and we shouldn't try to think too hard about it, as if, there would be a fear that in engaging in thoughtful study about this, it might lead us away from God. And, Lewis's approach suggests the opposite, that actually what the Christian faith has to say is most makes sense, even though, of course, it's still a dilemma. Of course, it's still really painful. Of course, it's still really difficult. But it makes the most sense of the possible explanations.
You talked about the fact that he's writing in the 40s and the 50s. That's a long time ago, right? I mean, the world is very different than it was. And yet there's a relevance there.
Yeah.
Is he sort of looking into the future, or is it he's just talking about timeless truths that anyone can sort of recognize if they think about it hard enough?
Well, it's interesting. So Lewis's own experience is of childhood bereavement, the horror of boarding school and being bullied, and actually genuinely traumatic childhood experiences. He went to the front in the First World War, experienced war, was wounded, came then to Oxford, and as a sort of Northern Irish person, felt like he was an outsider amongst colleagues, and then suffered bereavement of the love of his life. So, you take any one of those experiences and you think it is a different age and, of course, a different time, but you're talking about childhood trauma from war, grief and bereavement. A lot of those things are very relatable to people in wealthy Western societies. And so he would obviously say that he's kind of writing about and drawing on timeless truths. And I will look at this in the lecture. I think the extent to which he's making applications into the cultural moment, that there might be some changes in how I would approach things to how he did there. But the core fundamentals that he's exploring have definitely stood the test of time. And that's fascinating.
We're really looking forward to the lecture. It's going to be September the 21st, 2024.
Yes.
We hope people will be here for it. You can find out about details for that and when we start registration. There is registration for it because we have a limited bit of room, but we expect between 400 and 600 people to be there.
Wonderful.
Which is fantastic. But we also know that people who can't be in Houston for this can join us perhaps by streaming it at the time. It'll be available. That address, if you're interested in that, go to info@lanierlibrary.org, info@lanierlibrary.org, and just ask how you can stream the lecture. Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing, we're so grateful for you being a part of this today.
You.
We look forward.
Really looking forward to it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's exciting. You're going to be doing so much for us while we're here, including going out and lecturing for a couple of days at Lubbock Christian University. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Thanks so much for being with us today here on the Stone Chapel Podcast. Hey, thank you, Amy. There's no problem more thorny than the problem of pain and suffering and how that fits into our idea of what it is to be human and our idea of God. So I hope you're going to join us for the lecture. It's going to be September the 21st, 2024 at the Lanier Theological Library. You can do that in person, but you need to register because registration is opening up in August of 2024. We have limited seating, so register early. Go to our website, laniertheologicallibrary.org, to register. Better yet, why don't you start receiving our newsletter every month? It's just one a month. That way you can stay up with our lectures and our classes and everything else that's going on at the library. For those who can't be there, you can stream it online. You can do it live or you can watch it later on our YouTube channel. I'll say thanks to Kathy Capes, Phil Kecke, and Jessica Mauser for helping us produce this podcast. Thanks as well to you for listening.
If you listen to the podcast, you know that I love research. I used to lead a research company. So I love when research helps to illustrate a question we have. And one of the questions a lot of people are having is, how do we look to the decline of the family, maybe the relationship around fatherhood and issues of faith and church? Well, again, the Communio nationwide study on faith and relationships actually points to the collapse of marriage, where resident fatherhood fits into that, and how they all point ultimately to a relationship to Christianity and decline in the church. So visit communio.org/study to download Communio's nationwide study on faith and relationships.